This clip shows two ICE trains that are due to arrive in Braunschweig, Germany at 10 a.m. The time is 10 a.m. This type of event occurs regularly all over Europe, but particularly in Germany and Switzerland. Schedules are common and generally essential for almost any business. Knowledge of scheduling practices is essential for anyone managing a business that tells its customers what to expect when. Railroads, like any other business, make extensive use of scheduling. However, schedules alone are insufficient for an efficiently operated railroad. Timetables and the practice of timetabling are essential. Although scheduling is generally a relatively simple exercise, timetabling requires substantial skill and effort to produce an effective result. Why are schedules needed? In a way, that seems like a simple and even rhetorical question. The customers of all businesses that produce a product or a service, which would be virtually all businesses, expect to know when the product or service will be delivered. That may be an appointment with a doctor or an appliance repair service. It may be the delivery date for a new car or the arrival of a purchase that will be shipped. It may be the time that a transportation vehicle, airplane, bus, train, or boat, leaves the boarding point and arrives at the destination. Scheduling is also a business requirement. When are employees going to be on duty and off? When will supplies be required? What processes must be initiated when in order to satisfy a delivery date? When must equipment and personnel be available? What delivery date can be promised? Scheduling is easy. How long does a process take? When does the process start? Process start plus the time the process takes is the time the process ends. If another process is dependent on the completion of a process, it can begin at or after the completion of that process. Here's an example. An independent truck owner-operator wants to start a business with scheduled service Chicago to Omaha to Kansas City to St. Louis to Chicago. Including some extra time for traffic, it takes 8 hours to drive from Chicago to Omaha, 3 hours Omaha to Kansas City, 4 hours Kansas City to St. Louis, and 6 hours St. Louis to Chicago. The trailer is unloaded and reloaded in Omaha in 3 hours. It takes 4 hours in Kansas City and St. Louis. That's it. Schedule's finished. Leave Chicago 8 a.m. Monday. Get to Omaha 5 p.m. Monday. Leave at 8 p.m. Arrive Kansas City at midnight. Leave at 4 a.m. Tuesday. Arrive St. Louis at 9 a.m. Out of there at 1 p.m. The truck arrives in Chicago at 8 p.m. Tuesday, and the cycle can start again on Wednesday morning. From this, the owner discovers that the possible equipment schedule cannot be handled by a single person because of the hours of service limitations. Either the amount of time spent in Omaha and St. Louis must be lengthened, or a second and perhaps third driver will be required. The owner scheduling the truck has no concern over what happens between Chicago and Omaha, or Omaha and Kansas City and St. Louis, or St. Louis and Chicago. The driver will take care of all that, passing slower traffic, changing to a less congested route, and detouring around construction. Trains are constrained by the track. The operator of the train does not have the freedom to pass slower vehicles or change routes to avoid congestion or construction. The train can only go where the track goes. If the operator of the train cannot do anything about traffic or track maintenance, the person developing the schedule must, or the train will not often run on time. Scheduling trains as if they were trucks can work. If there's only one train and there's no maintenance activity on the track. Railroads typically run more than one train at a time. That is generally a requirement for a commercially viable railroad that is not a dedicated shuttle service between two locations on a line that is only used for that service, such as between a coal mine and a power plant. Attempting to schedule trains as if they were trucks on a line with more than one train typically leads to unreliable service. In this example, the railroad claims to be scheduled, but the combination of schedules cannot run on time simultaneously. There are substantial delays inherent in this combination of schedules. Some railroads that claim to be scheduled railroads practice car scheduling. Car scheduling is similar to appliance service scheduling. The technician will be there on Tuesday between noon and 6 p.m. We guarantee it. An example freight shipment is handled by several switch engines and trains between origin and destination. When the shipment is tendered, it is scheduled. Switch engine WCSW1 will take the car from the customer track during its Monday morning shift and bring it to the yard. Monday night, the car leaves on a train, WCEC1. WCEC1 goes to Eastern City. It will leave the shipment in Midway City to be forwarded to its destination on the Southern Line. This is called Day 1 in schedule terms. Wednesday afternoon, the car leaves Midway City for Southern City on train MCSC3 on Day 3 of the schedule. On Friday morning, Day 5 of the schedule, the car is in a train that switch engine crew SCSW5 will take to the Southern City Industrial Area for delivery. Each train is on time if it contains all of the shipments that have been scheduled to be in it, and each shipment is on time if it is in all of the scheduled trains and arrives on the scheduled day. Scheduling railroad service and operations bears more similarity to scheduling manufacturing than it does to scheduling other transportation modes. In manufacturing, the schedule is dependent upon the availability of infrastructure as well as the availability of the materials required for manufacturing. Scheduling a manufacturing process, when only one order is processed, is similar to scheduling trains like a truck when there's no other trains. It can work. It may not be a viable economic model for the manufacturing facility, but it can work. It starts to fall apart when orders come in faster than the equipment can process the orders. The first order is taken at 9 a.m. It takes 3 hours to produce the product. Delivery is scheduled for noon. The next order comes in at 11 a.m. It takes 3 hours to make the product, so delivery is scheduled for 2 p.m. Oh, wait. The equipment won't finish the first order until noon. Production can't start until then. The second order won't be ready until 3 p.m., not 2 p.m. Another order is received at noon. 3 hours to produce, so it will be ready at 3 p.m. Whoops, there's a problem. The equipment won't finish the second order until 3 p.m. Now, 3 hours for production and the 3 p.m. order is ready at 6 p.m. Problem is, the plant employees must also get supplies for the second and third orders. They can't be making things from nothing, and they won't be at their equipment anyway. Now the 2 p.m. order won't be ready until 4 p.m. Since 3 orders were scheduled to be complete at 3 p.m. and the plant was to be idle then, an equipment maintenance contractor was scheduled to work on the equipment for an hour at 3 p.m. Well, that's not going to work. The equipment is still running the second order then. The contractor is waiting and the clock is running. So the third order is held so that the contractor can go to work at 4 p.m. The contractor is finished at 5 p.m. and it's quitting time for the contractor and for the plant employees. Today's last order will have to be produced tomorrow morning. Mussolini famously made the trains run on time. Nope, that's a myth. His point was threatening, yelling, screaming, and ultimately shooting people would make them do as they were told and run the trains on time. Sometimes modern management employs the same reasoning, short of shooting people. Railroads just don't work that way. Unless perhaps the one threatened is the one planning the operation, provided that what is physically possible meets the boss's expectations. What does work, however, is to threaten, yell, scream, and shoot people who do not say the trains are on time, whether they are or not. For Mussolini, that part worked pretty well. The 6 Ps. They describe the essential knowledge needed if the trains are to run on time. Proper planning prevents pathetically poor performance. Even the time that trains are run affects whether or not their schedules will work. A schedule that works for a train leaving its initial station at 9 a.m. might not work at 10 a.m. It might be even worse at 11 a.m. Whether it is on time is also dependent on when other trains are running. If one train runs at the same time every day, it may still be affected by other trains running at random times. Here are 6 examples that represent a service plan or transportation schedule on 60 miles of line, and 5 variations that involve the same trains but operating at different times. This is the service plan or transportation schedule. Train 1 makes the trip in 55 minutes, as do trains 2 and 3. Train 4 is a slower train. It makes the trip in 80 minutes. In variation A, the same 4 trains are operating but at different times. Train 1 makes the trip in 50 minutes, 5 minutes less than the schedule. Train 2 makes the trip in 60 minutes, 5 minutes more than the schedule. Train 3 makes the trip in 65 minutes, 10 minutes more than the schedule. And Train 4 makes the trip in 75 minutes, 5 minutes less than the schedule. Variation B is again the same 4 trains operating at different times. Train 1 makes the trip in the scheduled 55 minutes, as does Train 2. Train 3 takes 60 minutes, 5 minutes more than scheduled. And Train 4 makes the trip in 100 minutes, 20 minutes over schedule. In variation C, Trains 1, 2, and 3 make the trip in 50 minutes, 5 minutes under schedule. Train 4 takes 85 minutes, 5 minutes over schedule. In variation D, Trains 1 and 3 make the trip in 50 minutes, 5 minutes under schedule. Train 2 makes the trip in 60 minutes, 5 minutes over schedule. And Train 4 takes 95 minutes, 15 minutes over schedule. In variation E, Train 1 takes 50 minutes to make the trip, 5 minutes under schedule. Trains 2 and 3 take 70 minutes, 15 minutes over schedule. And Train 4 takes 145 minutes to make the trip, an hour and 5 minutes over schedule. The variation is much greater as the distance and number of trains increases. Each of these trains is not only providing the transportation the customers purchase, it is providing the logistical support for ensuing trains. Each train depends on locomotives and crew from a previous train. It may also depend upon cars and/or a telemetry device from a previous train. When there are wide variations in performance, ensuing trains may be delayed for lack of personnel or equipment from a previous train. Unlike on a highway, track maintenance is also traffic that must be planned and managed. Some large-scale work may be scheduled sufficiently in advance that train schedules can be adjusted to accommodate. Most track maintenance work, however, is planned around traffic rather than vice versa. If the traffic is unscheduled or incorrectly scheduled, producing randomness, juggling maintenance productivity in trains becomes a competition for the use of the track. Maintenance productivity often loses, at least until the track can no longer sustain the traffic. Temporary speed restrictions further disrupt the operation, reducing reliability, and therefore the supply of locomotives, crews, cars, and telemetry devices. However, that same disruption also further disrupts the maintenance activity that is needed in order to fix the situation. Because of the manufacturing-like requirement of only one train at a time can occupy a segment of track, just as a machine in the manufacturing facility can only produce one item at a time, scheduling must begin with dividing the infrastructure into segments that can only accommodate a single train and segments that are not affected by a train on another segment. The schedule must identify the period during which each train owns each segment of track. Many passenger stations pose a problem unique to passenger trains. If passengers must walk across tracks to reach the train, no train may pass between the train loading or unloading passengers in the station. The passenger train occupies all of the tracks that passengers must cross, as well as the track on which the locomotives and cars are standing. Think of a schedule as much more than a "when will my train leave and when will it get there" reference. A properly constructed schedule is literally a track resource allocation plan. Behind the scenes of the "when will my train leave and when will it get there" is the generally unseen list of track segments and the times that they are allocated to the train. However, the track segments and their allocation times will also generally be unseen in the form of a list. A computer modeling system will develop and use the segments and their allocation times in the form of a list, but that form is almost never seen or used by people. The period that a train owns a segment of track is called blocking time. Blocking time begins at the time that the train must have the authority to occupy the segment of track while moving at normal speed. Blocking time ends when the train has cleared the segment entirely and another movement may be authorized to occupy that segment. A time distance graph of a train that includes the rectangles representing the train's ownership of the segments in time and distance is called a blocking time diagram. As the train progresses, the rectangles representing the ownership of segments progress in the direction of increasing distance and time, producing a stair-step appearance known as a blocking time stairway. When the stringline diagram of a proposed timetable is a blocking time diagram, all conflicting allocations of track are plainly visible. If any of the rectangles representing track allocation for a train overlap any of the rectangles representing track allocation for another train, and there's not a separate track for each of the trains, there's a conflict. The schedule of the trains must be modified to eliminate the conflict. The boxes may touch each other, but they may not overlap. There are three important scheduling and timetable terms. Running time is the part of the schedule during which the train is moving. Dwell time is the part of the schedule during which the train is stopped for station activities such as boarding or alighting passengers or adding cars to or removing cars from the train. Waiting time is the part of the schedule during which the train is stopped to resolve a track resource allocation conflict with another train. All three are part of a train's schedule. Yards and large passenger stations are an important part of scheduling. Depending upon the circumstance, specific track allocation may not be necessary, but there must always be a way of knowing that the facility can accommodate a train when it is scheduled to arrive. Likewise, it must be known that a train scheduled to leave has a track from which to leave. A yard or passenger terminal is effectively a static environment. Unlike the main tracks, where the allocation concern involves the movement of the train along the line, the planning concern for yards and passenger terminals is occupied or not, and during what period. Trains appear, remain in one place for some period, and then disappear. They may appear or disappear into track that is represented by a blocking time diagram, or they may be disassembled and handled as cars in storage, classification, repair, or service rather than as trains. Track allocation in yards and large passenger stations is represented by a station traffic diagram. A station traffic diagram represents individual tracks intended to accommodate a full train, rather than segments of track that may be much shorter than a train and are typically represented in a blocking time diagram. The time that the train owns the track is shown, just as in a blocking time diagram. A progression is not represented, except that the diagram may show the direction from which the train enters the track and the direction to which it leaves. A properly constructed schedule must provide time for all predictable events and conditions. If the train encounters another train and the train is a scheduled train, the event is predictable. Permanent speed restrictions are predictable. If the schedule is intended to be effective only during a season that has characteristic conditions such as heavy rain, snow, heat, or cold, and these conditions are typically associated with speed restrictions or changes in the time needed at station stops, those time requirements are predictable. If the schedule is intended to be in effect during a period of construction that involves tracks out of service and speed restrictions, those events and conditions are predictable. If the schedule involves running the train through turnouts or crossovers, for example, to reach the track that has an adjacent station platform, The speed through those turnouts is a predictable condition. The dwell time needed at each station should be researched and predicted with the greatest possible accuracy. Normal dwell time for each train at each station is a predictable condition. Entirely unpredictable events occur during railroad operation. Track and signal failures, vehicle failures, unusual weather accompanied by reduced visibility, reduced traction, or extended passenger loading and unloading time, or severe weather that brings about washouts and landslides occur regularly and randomly. Sometimes they are seasonable, but may still occur randomly throughout the season during which they occur. There must be a way to mitigate these events or the service will not be reliable. The mitigation is buffer time and recovery time. Buffer time is a time that is added to schedules where one train must wait for the other in order to resolve track resource allocation conflict. Buffer time is used to mitigate the effect of a slightly late train on the train waiting for it. Buffer time is typically used in developing schedules throughout the world except in North America. Recovery time is time that is added to the schedule to mitigate the random events and occurrences that happen but cannot be predicted. In North America, recovery time is typically 8% of the total running, waiting, and dwell time in the schedule. Recovery time may be distributed along the line in an attempt to maintain on-time performance throughout the trip, or end-loaded, inserted between the final station and the station previous to it. This method is preferred in the U.S. because it presents the greatest chance of arriving at the final station on time after being delayed. Schedule tolerance is another important term. Schedule tolerance is the amount late that a train can be and still be called on time. Schedule tolerance must sometimes be considered when developing a timetable. Events that occur during schedule tolerance are basically delays. However, schedule tolerance must sometimes be considered when developing a timetable. In addition to the schedule tolerances that FRA applies to Amtrak, the Amtrak contract with the railroads over which it operates provide for an incentive payment for on-time operation. These contracts include a schedule tolerance for the determination of payments to the railroad. The goal of each railroad is on time for payment, not on time for passengers. There can be a substantial difference. If any interaction between trains requires close timing, the possibility of the railroad applying its license to delay trains under the umbrella of schedule tolerance must be considered. Consider that if the recovery time for a given schedule is 20 minutes and schedule tolerance is 20 minutes, a train may be delayed for 40 minutes and still be reported on time. That concept may be very detrimental to the precision needed to develop a conflict-free timetable that will remain that way in normal daily operation. Properly constructing schedules and timetables requires substantial time and effort. However, properly constructed schedules and timetables are essential to efficient and reliable railroad operation.